Good morning, or wherever you are. Good evening or good afternoon. But this recording is to bring you into the fullness of the understanding of Hanukkah. And I've come with my gelt and I have my dreidel, and I will be explaining those two in a moment and how they might be used and how are used. This is part one, and there will be a part two. So this is part one, coming at it from one perspective and then changing over to the other perspective. So you'll have to listen to both. Each I'm hoping is about 30 minutes long. But Hanukkah is, as you will see, is a very special time when God used a certain group of people, a small group of people, to do mighty acts of bravery. And he's calling us today, small groups of people all around the world, believers, to do acts of courage that are astonishing. So hang on for this little bit of a ride. And I want to put my screen up right away. And here we go. There it is on the Hanukkah. This minute, I'm just going to even move a couple of things. Yes. The Hanukkah, that is what you're seeing on the screen here right today. It can look at different ways. Here is one with, it's just different from the menorah. It's called a menorah, Hanukkah. As this one has 9 prongs. You'll see the one in the center. It's called the Shemesh, which is the guardian or the servant candle, if you will. It lights all the rest during this 8-day period called Hanukkah. And here is a picture of the feasts of the Lord, the 7 feasts. But you notice that Hanukkah is not here. And the 7 feasts include the spring feast and the middle feast of Shavuot, and then the fall feast. But if you look over on this area here, before the spring feast, there is a feast that's not mentioned, and it's the Feast of Purim. The Feast of Purim is the one that deals with Esther. And again, the courage that it took with Esther and Mordecai to overcome Haman and a people that were trying to decimate, to eradicate the Jewish people and the Jewish faith. Then you come over to the other side, and where we are is looking in the past the fall season, the fall feast, and we now come to Hanukkah. And again, this one, like Purim, is where a group of people tried to eradicate the Jewish faith and the Jewish people. And so God, again, was faithful. And so as we come into this, one of the first questions that people will ask is, did Yeshua, did Jesus observe Hanukkah? I know as believers, Christians, that often is the question. Yes, he did. In John 10, verse 22 to 24. And it says, now it was a feast of dedication, Hanukkah, in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. And then the Jews surrounded him and said to him, how long do you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Now, did you notice that it says a feast of dedication? That's what Hanukkah means, dedication. And it says in Jerusalem. And then notice it was winter. So we know that this is the feast of dedication that Jesus observed. And here is a picture of some of the things that you would see on Hanukkah. You'll see there's the candle. The Shemesh is the center one, as I said. There's a way of lighting it. You put the candles in from right to left. You light them from left to right. But it's an 8-day feast, again, because the 8 candles and the Shemesh making 9. And they is observed by the Jewish people for the Jew with different forms of of eating. You see the sufganiyot, which are jelly-filled donuts, calorie-filled donuts. You see below it the dreidel, which is a game that the kids play, and here see the gelt. These are chocolate covered with tinfoil, gold and silver. They use for the game with the dreidel and eat and have fun. Then, of course, there's a bowl here of olive oil. Why olive oil? Because so many of the foods during this time are fried, like latkes, potato pancakes, and lots of olive oil is used. So these are some of the symbols, and of course the Star of David there. These are the symbols that are used. Here's again the candle being lit, from put in from right to left, lit from left to right, and how they are done. But here are the gelts. Here are the chocolate-filled coins. Here is the dreidel. By the way, the dreidel is special because it has the message of Hanukkah. You have Nun, Gimel, Hey, Shin. Nun, again, these are an acronym, and each first letter of the word. So Nun is for Ness, miracle. Gimel, great. Hey, for Haye, for happened. And then Shin, there. And so a great miracle happened there. Now, if you're in Jerusalem, they changed this last one, the Shin, and it becomes a great miracle happened here. If you're anywhere in Israel, they would use that. And they as they spin these dreidels, the kids, they have to either, you can see in the game action, you either do nothing, or you get all the gals, or you get half of them, or you have to give one, depending on which one it shows up on. So I just want to say the last of the candles are lit. Now, where does this occur? A lot of people say, how does this fit into it? Just remember that the last of the prophets, and that's, the Italian prophet Malachi. No, it's Malachi. He's not Italian, but this was written. Malachi was written somewhere between 400 BC and 450 BC. The discussions on that, but there was a 400-year period of silence before the birth of Jesus. And of course, there's lots of discussion on when was Jesus actually born. Was he born 4 BC? Was he born 1 BC? Was he born 1 AD? I'll leave that for you to decide in the discussions, but it would be somewhere in that period. So the whole story of Hanukkah happens right in the middle of that. And that's when the Maccabean revolt took place. The Maccabean revolt took place in 167 BC, between the writing of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, and the New Testament, beginning with the birth of Jesus. So here is a map. Here's a map of the ancient Hellenistic world, the Greek world. And the reason I bring this up, you'll see in a moment, was because after Alexander the Great died, and he had a 10-year period where he conquered the whole world, but he died probably of syphilis. He died very young, and the empire was divided into to his 4 sons, and the 4 areas. You'll see the largest, the yellow here, is Seleucus. This is the important one. This is where the story of Hanukkah will be taking place. You also notice down here in the south is Egypt, the green one. And then these are the 2 largest of the 2. And then, of course, you have Cassandra and Lysimachus. Those are over in the Greece, Turkey area. And so this is the breakdown following Alexander the Great. Now, here's a picture that is often used, and you can see that Alexander the Great is seen as the ram, and there are 4 horns. And you can see here's the Seleucus. That was the yellow, the largest one. And you notice down here, Ptolemy, that's the green. That was the second largest. And then the two smaller ones, Lysimachus and Cassandra. These are the four horns that talks about. We'll come to that in Daniel. I'll do that next in part 2, in the next part. And then, of course, you want to see the little horn that came out of here. And that's again in the book of Daniel, talking about, referring to Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. And of course, this man, and we know he exists. He has coins that are back from that stage. We have statues and that he of his reign, and his name was not Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes was the name he gave himself, which means God manifest. God manifest. And so we see here, let me just walk through a little bit of the history here. So we're talking about, again, in 175 BC, Antiochus deposes his brother's murder. Now, this kingdom was had been given down to his brother, and then his brother was murdered, and Antiochus deposes the person who killed his brother. He becomes the king. Now, when he becomes the king, believe it or not, the Jewish leaders, this is important, the Jewish leaders go to Antiochus to make a covenant. They say, we want to have peace. We want to have prosperity. We don't want to be fighting. We will become more Greek. We will follow your ways. We'll compromise our faith. We will do whatever it takes to adjust and have life and happiness and peace. Now, this was the Jewish leaders that went to Antiochus, and he agreed to that because he was trying to Hellenize the whole world. He was trying to make the whole world completely Greek and Greek in all their ways. Then we have 5 years later, Ptolemy in Egypt. He seeks to expand his territory. By the way, Ptolemy is an uncle to this Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he wants to expand his territory. So Antiochus says, no way. He goes down there and he invades and defeats his Ptolemy, his uncle, but spares his life because they are related. Then he goes back, and on the return from Egypt, coming back into Syria, up in that area called the Seleucid Empire, he plunders the sanctuary in Jerusalem. He plunders the temple. He takes the gold. He takes the silver. He takes the valuables. And that's recorded in the book of Maccabees. And then, of course, Antiochus, 2 years later, he attacks Ptolemy again because Ptolemy raises up and is trying to expand. But this time when Antiochus attacks in Egypt, he is stopped by the ambassador of Rome. Rome is just rising at this time. Rome is just becoming stronger, just beginning. It's going to develop in the next 100 years, if you will see in a moment. And but anyway, he was stopped. He came back. Antiochus was furious. And as he goes back, he returns back again. He has to go through what we'd call Israel. And Antiochus, he sends Apollonius. Remember that name, Apollonius. Apollonius has a huge sword, a sword larger than anybody else's sword. He's a powerful man, and he sends Apollonius to make a covenant of peace. But this is a really deception. It's to deceive the Jews into peaceful intents. He sends Apollonius, and Apollonius does. He makes the peace. He makes the covenant. And then Antiochus arrives a short time later. He breaks the covenant, and he then imposes his fullness of all he's doing. By the way, when the covenant was originally made, when Antiochus first came into power, Antiochus commanded them to set up gymnasiums and various other things that were Greek The gymnasiums were places where, yes, they did exercises, they did their workouts, but there's also prostitution there. There was um, uh, homosexuality practiced, and all forms of evil. And they set those up all throughout Israel. By the way, not everybody in Israel agreed with that. The leadership did, but many of the people were purists. They were observant Jews. They loved Torah. They practiced the feast. But of course, many in the leadership did not. And in many ways, it's the same today. 60% of the people that live in Israel are secular. They are even agnostic and atheistic. And there's a small number, a small majority, a small minority that practice and are observant. And but in that same today. Anyway, that's going on. So when Antiochus breaks this covenant, he puts the altar in the Holy of Holies. In the Holy of Holies, he puts the idol of Zeus, a statue of Zeus. That was in 167 BC. And then he also, at that time, built altars throughout the city. He had them burn incense in their houses. This was to the gods and to the pagan gods. He tore and burned all the Torah scrolls. Anybody that had a Torah scroll that hid one, tried to keep one, death penalty, death. Violence he incited in the cities. He did this as a means of just destroying the fabric of the Israeli society. He wanted to break the Jewish solidarity apart. So he incited, and we read this in the book of Maccabees. And then finally, on the 25th of Kislev, remember I said this is the beginning, this is when Feast of Dedications that we celebrate right now. On the 25th of Kislev, he had a pig sacrificed on the altar in the temple. And then he also brought out mothers and families who had circumcised their children. He actually did describe very graphically. He had the circumcised baby hung on the mother's neck, and this is where they were still living. And then they used the sword to kill the baby, and then they also many times killed the mother as well. And they also put a death penalty on anyone who would not eat what considered unclean food. Kosher food was stopped. You now ate what the Greeks did. You would have all the non-kosher foods, and it was a death penalty if you did not follow. So there was total accommodation required. So that's when in 167 the Maccabee family rose up and said, enough is enough. And they finally defeated Antiochus and dedicated the temple in 164 BC, just a little bit over 3-year period. Now, these are described, and I'll do this in the part 2, Daniel 12, Daniel 7, and Daniel 8. And we will come back to that. But let me just walk through. I want to just walk through with the Maccabees, their heart, the heart of the Maccabee people. Then the first one I want to talk about is the father, Mattathias. Mattathias, when he heard about the sacrifice of the pig, the abomination of desolation on the altar in the temple, he was furious. And he says in 1 Maccabees 2, he says, alas, why was I born to see this? The ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to dwell there when it was given over to the enemy, the sanctuary given over to aliens. Why should we live any longer? And Mattathias and his sons rent their clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned greatly. Now hear the heart, hear his heart. Now Mattathias, by the way, was recognized as a leader. He was living down in Moadim. That's down by Tel Aviv, south of Jerusalem, but really close to Tel Aviv, Moadim. Moadim still exists today. And he was approached because they wanted him to come on board. They wanted him to bring the rebels, the ones who didn't want to conform. They wanted him to lead them so they wouldn't have to destroy them, wouldn't have to fight with them. And so they sent an envoy down, Antiochus did, to Moedim, and it called forth Mattathias and set up a proposal, said, come into the covenant, you lead the way, and you will be given lavish gifts and authority. But Mattathias, it says, but Mattathias has answered and said in a loud voice to the envoy, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, and have chosen to do his commandments, departing each one from the religion of their fathers, yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenant of our fathers. So basically he said, no way, I will follow the covenant of my fathers, the covenant of my God. And then he says, far be it for us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right nor to the left. Amazing words, defiant words, but words of loyalty to Yahweh. And so that at that time, when he just said no to it, one of the other Jews, a fellow Jew, rose up and said, I will do this. I will do this. I'll lead the way. And he offered a pig on the sacrifice of the altar, and Mattathias killed him right on the spot. And then it says, then Mattathias has cried out in the city with a loud voice, saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come with me. And let me go back to that. And it says, he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the city. So they had to go into the caves and live in the caves. And Mattathias now becomes an enforcer of the Torah. But Mattathias comes a year later, and he's sick, and he's on his deathbed. 166 BC, he addresses his children, and it says, now the days drew near for Mattathias as to die, and he said to his sons, listen to this, arrogance and reproach had now become strong. It is time of ruin and furious anger. Now, my children, show zeal for the law and give your lives for the covenant of our fathers. So here's a father who's standing and giving his sons and saying, you are my sons. I have taught you well. I've taught you about the covenant. I've taught you about the loyalty to Yahweh. Now, show your zeal for the law. Give your lives for the covenant of our fathers. And he goes on, and so observe from generation to generation that none who put their trust in him will lack strength. Do not fear the words of a sinner, for his splendor will turn into dung and worms. Today he will be exalted, but tomorrow he will not be found, because he has returned to the dust, and his plans will perish. My children, be courageous, grow strong in the law, for by it you will gain honor. Wow, wow, what's amazing words, challenging his sons. And so his sons were led by not the oldest one, but by Judas Maccabee, meaning hammer. Judas was the one who was a warrior chosen by the father to lead. Now, I'm just going to walk you through very quickly some of these battles that were won. Now, first first one that came, Antiochus sent Apollonius. Remember the one with the big sword? They gathered an army from Samaria, and he was defeated, and his sword was taken. Judas Maccabees actually took the sword and used it. Remember now, the Maccabeans, these Judas Maccabea, and the ones that followed him, they were the priestly family. They gathered followers. None of them were warriors. None of them had sword. None of them had armor. They were basically common people who were not trained militarily. But Polonius was actually defeated by this small group of people led by Judas Maccabees. Then another man, Seron, he saw what happened, and he was with pride. He said, and his pride just burst forth. He says, I will defeat them. And he would put together an army called the Syrian army from Syria itself. He gathers at Beth Horon, and Judas addresses his men. And Judas calls forth his men, and he says, "Let's fight for the Lord." 800 were killed by the army of Saron, and very few were killed in Judas's men. And the army of Saron fled to Gaza, and it says in the book of Maccabees, there was terror in the land. Wow, and Antiochus was angry. Antiochus says, we will defeat this unruly group of people. He gathers a huge army. As a matter of fact, he pays them a year ahead of time. He is so angry and is so determined that he's going to wipe out the Jewish people, the Jewish faith. And but unfortunately, he runs out of money. He didn't count for how much this would cost, and he has to go to Persia, which is now Iran. And he goes to Persia with half of his army, but he sends the other half with Lysias. He says, take my other half and you go and attack Judas, wipe them out. I don't want them anymore. He commanded to destroy Israel. He had sent a whole team. He had elephants included in the attack army. The elephants were huge animals that caused great problems for anyone that was fighting against them. And he also brought not the Ptolemy in Egypt, but another Ptolemy and a Nicanor and Gorgias. And these were strong leaders. And he brought 40,000 infantry, 40,000 trained men in weaponry and armor and fighting, and 7,000 cavalry, 7,000 on horses. Now, this was a force to be reckoned with. This was only half, of course, what Antiochus had control. So Lysias goes to the plain of Emmaus, and Judas and his men prepare for battle. Now, remember, again, they're greatly outnumbered. They are not trained for war. They gathered at Mizpah. You remember that's where Jacob had made an altar, and when Laban after Jacob came out with Leah and Rebecca, Leah and oh my goodness, I'm a senior moment. Anyway, he gathered there to pray, and they repented, and Judas and his army cry out to God in desperation. Again, I just want you to see how he says, how will we be able to withstand them if thou dost not help us? So he's crying out to them. So Gorgias leads 5,000 infantry and 1,000 selected cavalry to attack Judas by night, but Judas was alerted. So now here Lysias, he's in Emmaus, but he sends Gorgias out to do a night attack. And he uses 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry to lead this. But Judas is alerted. He is a God moment. There's a moment when Judas found out about this sneak attack. So Judas leaves where they were, and he comes into Emmaus itself with 3,000 men. So Judas has got 3,000 men, and he has little armor, very few swords, and he's going against 35,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. And guess what happens? It says here in 1 Maccabees 4, at daybreak, Judas appeared in the plain with the 3,000 men, but they did not have armor and swords such as they desired, and they saw the camp of the Gentiles strong and fortified with cavalry around about it, and these men were trained in war. But Judas said to the men who were with him, do not fear their numbers or be afraid when they charge. Remember how our fathers were saved at the Red Sea, and when Pharaoh and his forces pursued them. And now let us cry to heaven and see whether he will favor us, and remember his covenant with our fathers, and crush this army before us today. Then all the Gentiles will know that there is one who redeems and saves Israel. Well, praise the Lord. So Judas attacks, but how does he attack? He's only got 3,000 and they're not trained. He does it with shofars and boldness. They attack in a yelling and screaming, blowing shofars, and 3,000 of the enemy of Lysias were killed, and they fled. And then suddenly, Gorgias, who was doing that night attack, he couldn't find where Judas and his men were. So he comes back to Emmaus, and guess what? He sees them running, fleeing, and so he flees as well. He goes to Gaza. So again, great, great courage and a great victory for Judas. Now, 1 year later, Lysias returns. Again, Antiochus sends them back. He says, go back. This time, 60,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry. They go to Beth Zur, and he says, wipe them out. Judas now has gathered a few more. He's got 10,000 men, but look at the numbers. 10,000 that Judas has versus 60,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry. Cavalry meaning they have horses and they ride horses. Judas wins another great victory, and 5,000 of the enemy were killed, and Gorgias retreats home and limping back, and they were afraid of the courage of the Judas's men. It says in the book of Maccabees. So praise the Lord for that. And so now we come to some of this is the cleansing of the temple. So the Maccabees go in there, and we read this in First Maccabees 4 about what they did. They cleansed the temple, rededicated it. That's what the Hanukkah means, dedication. They dedicated the temple on Kislev 25, 164 BC. It says Judas dedicates the temple, and it goes on to say he offered sacrifice as the Torah directs on a new altar. They rebuilt an altar. The dedication with songs, harps, lute, cymbals. The people fell on their face and they worshiped. They celebrated for 8 days of celebration. They restored and redecorated the front of the temple and the gates. This is all recorded in the book of Maccabees. And it says in First Maccabees 4:59, then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season, every year from then on, the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed with gladness and joy for 8 days. So this Hanukkah was set for 8 days based on that fact of the victory. It says beginning with the 25th day of the month of Kislev. And then it goes on in the second Maccabees to explain it even more in chapter 10. It says, now upon the same day that the temple had been polluted by the strangers, on that very same day, it was cleansed again, to wit, on the 25th day of the month of Kislev. And they kept 8 days with joy after the manner of the Feast of Tabernacles. So this whole Hanukkah is based on the Feast of Tabernacles, which they could not observe because they were fighting in that just before the dedication, remembering that not long before they had kept the Feast of Tabernacles when they were in the mountains and in the dens like wild beasts. Therefore, they now carried boughs and green branches and palms for him that had been given them good success in cleansing this his place. Now, what does that sound like? The boughs and the green branches, palms, that's a lulav. That's what's the Feast of Tabernacles. And then, so you can see the connections here. And they ordained by common statute and decree that all the nation of the Jews should keep these days every year. So that's where we have. Now, let me just, I'm going to wrap up here very quickly, but the miracle of the oil. I know that many people, Jews included, when they think of Hanukkah, they talk about the miracle of the oil, the miracle of the oil that lasts 8 days. May I just briefly say, and maybe I can talk about it in part two a little bit more, but it's not recorded in First or Second Maccabees. Nothing about an oil lasting 8 days is recorded in any Jewish history. It is recorded, though, in the Megillah Tanit, the scroll of fasting. It's codified in the Gemara and the Talmud. That's a huge part of the Talmud, in which the exposition of the word is done. But it first appears codified, written down in 400 to 600 AD. That's 400 to 600 years. That's almost 500 to 700 years past when the rededication of the temple took place. And I'm just going to stop by saying the Maccabean priesthood became corrupt. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the second part of the teaching. So I just want to go very quickly here to the lessons, and I'm going to close off. What are the lessons that we can learn today? Number one, God honors the courage of those who honor his word. And I just want to encourage everyone listening, God honors those who honor his word. And so this is a time when we're being challenged in our societies do you honor the word? Will you follow him? God honors fathers who pass on their faith to their children. As he did with Mattathias, does with us. He honors parents who pass on their faith to their children. Then number three, God honors those who place their full trust in him despite overwhelming odds. Judas Maccabees again and again had to continually rely fully in the Lord because they were outnumbered atrociously, and yet they said, we trust in the Lord. He will be faithful to us against overwhelming odds. Number four, God rejoices with those who love purity and his word. The dedication of the temple was a beautiful, beautiful time of rejoicing. And you could just sense, even in the writing of the Maccabees, how God was pleased with the joy of and the purity of cleansing and of honoring his word. And lastly, I put here, God hates compromise of the faith. He hates it when the leadership at the very beginning compromised their faith, sold out their faith to Antiochus. He hated when the others did not keep the faith, and he had to hide in the hills and gather an army to oppose what Antiochus was doing. But God hates compromise. Today, when we see the compromising of our faith, we have to understand that this is not pleasing to our God. And so I just want to end with that. And I just want to say, I hope that this has helped you to understand a little bit about the Hanukkah and its beginnings and how important it is for us to stand strong in our faith on this day. So I'm going to go and just end this right now, and we'll be starting part two if you wish to listen to that as well.